Are you interested in adding some reusability into your API solution? In this video, I'm going to demonstrate a problematic system API design that I've seen numerous times when trying to update values into an enterprise system. Afterwards, we'll build a much better solution. A single patch endpoint that will consolidate multiple APIs into one that is reusable, scalable, flexible, and easy to maintain. To get started, let's talk about the common use case we're going to deal with today. We have data coming from another system, and we need to update our account objects inside our Salesforce enterprise system. In this case, the account is already created, so what we need to do is just update it with the information coming through an API. Using MuleSoft's API-led connectivity approach, what we'll do is we'll create a system API that wraps Salesforce and enables the functionality that we need. This is what that looks like in Endpoint Studio. And today we'll be working with Mule Server version 4.3.0 and Endpoint Studio 7.9.0. So we have our CRM Salesforce system API, and in it we have a listener that listens on path customers/shipping address, and what it does is takes in information and it'll update shipping address information on an account. Walking through the flow, what we do is I like to save a common identifier so that we can include it in logging, and it will persist across transports. So in our logger, we have just request to update account shipping address detected, and then we put our unique identifier in it. Having this identifier here is really good for production support, and I have a whole video about a logging strategy if you want to check that out. Link is above. And this is where my transport message will take my input payload and map it to Salesforce object properties. And you'll see in my payload what I'm passing in to the endpoint is just a shipping street, shipping city, province or state, postal code or zip, shipping country, and any instructions. And this gets mapped here one-to-one. We upload it to an account type in Salesforce, and then we have whether the account was successful or whether it's false. We have different error messaging. Maybe I'll do a video on dealing with connectors. That sometimes that you'll return back a 200 from the connector, but it means that the call was successfully in processing, but the update actually failed. So running this flow, what it'll do is go into my Salesforce account, whatever ID I passed it into. So this is my Salesforce ID. You'll see it if I click into the account I created. Ends with QAV, ends with QAV. And what I'm doing is just updating the shipping address label here, as well as any shipping instructions. Let me change that to leave on front steps, and then we'll put that through. Here's our account ID, transform message. You'll see it's been transformed with the new shipping instructions. This is a custom field I created because it's not on default on the account object in Salesforce. And there's the data I want to write to it. Leave on front steps. If it went to the top, it was successful, which it did. Have my message success with a description and 200 status. So if I refresh my object, go to details, leave on front steps is now the shipping instructions. Perfectly fine API, it works. Not too thrilled about having a shipping address on the top level of an object in my payload. I'd rather have it like an array of addresses, so it could be more flexible to add more, but it proves the case out, and I've seen APIs built like this in many places that I've worked at. But where we get problematic with this API is when we have a request that comes on later down the road where, say, someone wants to update a different part of the Salesforce account object. So let's say 6 months later, new developer gets a request that say, hey, we have these extra fields called email confirmed and email confirmed date on the account that we need to update when created a new account, and then they confirm their email address, clicking that verify link in an email. We need to now save that for compliance on the account object so we know whether they validated their email address or not. So what typically happens is the developer looks at the code, sees, hey, there's already an update customer shipping address. Let me just create a customer email confirmation, which works the same way. But in this case, instead of passing the shipping address, I now pass those two fields, whether the email's been confirmed and the confirmed date. And that listener I have built here handles the customers, which is what you could say is our name for an accounts. And then what we're updating is email confirmation. Same pretty much exact flow. Let's take the account ID, which is the Salesforce ID, so we can put it in our loggers. Here we're creating our payload to update into Salesforce just with the two fields. So the two fields get mapped to our custom fields in Salesforce, and then we update it, the account type, and then if it's successful, we print out success message. If not, we log an error level and we say that, hey, there was an error updating Salesforce account. Runs pretty much the same way. Step through, gets our transform message, builds our JSON payload that Salesforce wants, updates it. Top choice means it was successful. I get my message success. And if I go into Salesforce, look at the account with the ID I updated, into details, and now we have confirmed the checkbox is true, and I have the date of May 13th. And you may think this is a good solution, and it is. It works. However, if you keep getting these types of requests, what's end up happening is every time you need to update a field in Salesforce on the account object, you're going to be building another API and then another API. And you're going to have multiple flows for every field set that you want to update. And they're literally potentially going to be the exact same components. Hopefully they all stay the same. But what I find is happening is somebody will make one just a simple end-to-end. People will add some better logging to theirs, but not update the other ones. Someone will add a new error handling technique for just the one that they've added. So what that ends up happening is you have a whole bunch of these. They're tougher to maintain. Nobody wants to touch the previous one. Ends up being splintered, tougher to manage. And as they grow, the number of flows can get out of control. An improvement on the solution and more aligned with RESTful principles is to have one update on the account resource that can handle multiple fields. So for example, our URI is now the customer object and then the Salesforce ID. We're modifying customers by ID, and I put it under the patch method because technically it's not a put because we don't have the whole object of customers every time. We only have a subset of fields. So what we're really doing is just patching a few fields on our customer resource, which just because the backend is Salesforce happens to be an account type. So theoretically in our body, we have shipping fields here, but this endpoint would be able to handle whether I pass in the shipping detail changes or whether I pass in the email confirmation. So something like this. So how would we do that in MuleSoft? We have one listener, customers, resource, account ID, same type of logging. But in this transform message, what we're going to do is check to see if we have our payload is updating the shipping details. And then we'll copy over the mapping we had before. Or it's the payload that comes in from the process API that's updating the email confirmation details. We'll just pass it on there. And because we know that a shipping address isn't going to be in this request, we can just check to see if, hey, if shipping address is there, then we know we're updating the shipping addresses. If it's not there, then we know it's the second request. So then we could just update that. Did I catch you? Do not implement this. This is not a good solution. So what this does is hard code us to two different types of requests. What happens if we have a third one? Are we going to have an if else and then an if else if we have a fourth use case? What if we have a use case that sometimes has shipping and email confirmations together? So this is very inflexible and potentially error prone once we get over two simple use cases. So we do not want to do this solution. So let's get rid of this transform message. What we could do instead is taking advantage of this attribute called skip null on everywhere. So what this essentially does is exactly what the name sounds like. So it'll skip null values in the specified data structure. So in our case, in our input JSON object, it'll ignore the key value pairs that have null as the value. Let's show that in action. So in this case, we're passing in the shipping details with no email confirmation fields. So we're in the transform message. Essentially, after this component, we should have all the shipping address fields as well as the email confirmed fields. But you'll notice that there's no email confirmed fields in here. So essentially, this payload.email confirmation is going to be null. So our skip null on anywhere, when we get the payload out, looks like this. The payload now only kept the fields that weren't null. So when we go to update Salesforce, we're not updating email confirmed field. We're not updating confirmed date. We're just updating the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields that had values. So now I can go to update, and it was successful. So the good thing about this API is now I can pass in these fields, pass the transform message, and I'm only updating now Salesforce those two fields. So I essentially combined those two APIs into one that can be reused for different fields. And if we really wanted to, this even adds us the flexibility if we wanted to do multiple fields. So say we wanted shipping address and province address, as well as the email confirmation date a day later. This should have the 4 fields only from our payload. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we can use a combination of their both. So you can see how flexible this is too if we wanted to reuse it even for a new use case that comes in. Say we have a new use case that wants to update an email address. We have this request. All we have to do, we don't have to build a new API. We just go into this transform message and just add one new line. I don't know what the field name is in Salesforce. Email address. Let's just say it's that. And then I can do payload dot whatever it was in here. And we're done. That's the beauty of reusability. Our use case in the old way, we'd have to build out a whole new API, change the RAML structure, create a new endpoint, copy all these components, do the error handling. But using this case, it's now literally a one-line change. There's only one slight issue that could come up with this solution. And it may not even be relevant in your organization and what enterprise system you're uploading into. But because we're doing skip null on anywhere, means the transform message will remove this type of element where the value is null. This would only ever be a problem if you ever needed to erase or clear out a value in a field. To demonstrate this, let me show you shipping instructions. Shipping instructions right now has leave on front porch. However, say I wanted to change the address to somewhere in Toronto, leave on front steps may not be applicable to this address. So I want to erase the shipping instructions when I update this address. So if I pass in null, you can see shipping address isn't even on there. So when I go to update, it was successful. It's still there. So I have my new Toronto shipping address, but the shipping instructions are no longer valid. So you just got to keep in mind that, hey, every time you want to erase something, whenever you call it from your API, whether that's from potentially a process layer, you can't use the word null. So let's use a blank value instead, or empty string. So now you'll see the shipping instructions key is now there, and I got my blank string. So I'm going to step through Salesforce, refresh. However, shipping instructions is still there. This is what I mentioned earlier about it really depends on what you're updating. So Salesforce has this weird quirk where if you try to pass in a null string, for text fields, it doesn't wipe. You actually have to pass in null. So if we can't pass in null, how are we ever going to blank out a field in Salesforce? So if this pertains to you, I have another option to accommodate this. My final flow has a slightly different transform message. So in this one, we're going to only add the field if it is present in the incoming payload. So there's no longer any skip on nulls on anywheres. The only way it gets added, for example, shipping street, is if the payload has shipping street in it as its key. So there's a good data weave function called names of, which will pull the keys and put them in an array. And now for every field, what we do is just check if that payload field has that key in it. So every value that could be updated has a line in here. So let's show this in action to make it a little clearer. So for example, here, I'm going to put back my shipping instructions null. And I'm going to update the address to 1. So we're on the transform message. And let me show you what this keys array looks like. So if you do names of, it's essentially just an array with every key, Salesforce ID and all the shipping. And shipping instructions is in our key as there. So when it checks the key, it's going to include it now with the value null, which we can see here. So shipping addresses is now null, doesn't get screened, and we only still have the fields that we passed into the API request. So there's no email confirmation fields. Now if we go to update it, make sure it goes in the top flow. Got our success. Now if I refresh our account, leave steps on front porch is still there. That is because there's one little nuance I need to show you. If you're using the Salesforce connector 9.11 or earlier, on the connector configuration in general, there'll be a field down here called can clear fields by updating field value to null. You need to set that to true in order to allow the nulls to erase fields in Salesforce. If you're using a later version, which I am, which is currently the latest 10.10.5, there's an extra field you need to put inside your transform. And this is all documented in this knowledge article I'll post in the description of this video. You'll see what I mentioned. If it's the connector is 9.11 or earlier, you can just use the advanced section, can clear fields by updating field to null drop-down list. But if it's 10.0 or later, it's a little different. You have to add this extra field that's an array of the keys that you want to blank out. So for example, if first name is null, and you want Salesforce to wipe it, you have to create this extra fields to null and have an array that has first name in it. You can ignore this part for now. So it kind of gives you an example of how to automate it. This one here doesn't really work because it's assuming the payload is not this payload. The payload is the one coming in. So if your values here, which are clearly different than the Salesforce key, it's going to map the wrong ones. So what I do instead is just write it as usual, get the payload converted to where the keys are the Salesforce field names, and then we can add a field in a new transform message. We're only going to want to add it if there are any nulls in there. And you're getting a little error on here because value set is in its own module. Let's run this. Shipping instructions is null. Step through. Our payload has all the keys as the Salesforce name. I have the null here. This transform message will now add this fields to null, and it detects that this key is the only one that is null. So it's an array of one key. So now I go into Salesforce. This was successful. Hit the refresh. And shipping instructions has been wiped out. And I'm going to end it there for this video. So what we did is, instead of having multiple system API endpoints in the same object in Salesforce, we created one RESTful standard approved API that can be customized for any type of data that you wants to come in. So we called it a patch method. Now all data that wants to be updated into customers goes through one flow and can handle any type of field name that you want. And you don't even have to implement this when you're getting 2 or more use cases. If you implement this from the first one, you can anticipate for when the second use case comes in that you need to update on customers. And that person that has to implement it will thank you, because all they have to do is change one line of code in the transform message. So we have reusability built in from the start, easily identified RESTful APIs. We avoided complexity and potential duplication across many flows. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in more tutorials on integration and MuleSoft technology, please make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Peace.